Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Today on Writers at Work, I'll be speaking with Eddie Muller, who is best known as the host of TCM's Noir Alley, where his delightful, informative intros and outros to classic noir films serve as an education for even the most devoted film buffs. I've known Eddie for years, first as an author via his books Dark City, The Lost World of Film Noir, Dark City Dames, and his work with Tab Hunter on the actor's memoir. Eddie's debut novel, The Distance, was inspired by his father's colorful career covering boxing out of San Francisco, as was its sequel, Shadow Boxer. Eddie's most recent book is Eddie Muller's Noir Bar, Cocktails Inspired by the World of Film Noir. In 1988, working with American Cinematique, Eddie began programming noir film festivals, first in LA, then San Francisco, and then in major cities across the country. In 2005, he founded the Film Noir Foundation, not only to celebrate classic film noir, but to restore films thought beyond repair. I encourage lovers of film noir and great filmmaking to check out filmnoirfoundation.org for Noir City film festivals and Noir City magazines. There's much to discuss with Eddie, who I've called a national treasure, and I mean it. Today we'll focus on his writing, a component of his career that I consider undervalued. Eddie Muller, welcome to Writers at Work.
Jim, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Great. Me too. A minute or so ago, I mentioned your dad. Was he a film buff also?
No, not at all. But my dad had no use for movies. I think real life had enough melodrama for him. So no, although I do have very fond and vivid memories of going to see certain movies with my dad. Like Raging Bull. I saw Raging Bull with my dad, and I'm not making this up, Jim. He actually, at one point in the midst of one of Scorsese's operatic fight scenes, my dad yells out in the theater, "For God's sake, stop the fight!"
I watched the setup recently, and I was thinking, God, Eddie's dad must be in this thing someplace.
It certainly feels like it.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the world that I grew up in. So that's, when people have asked in the past, like, how did you get into film noir and all that stuff? It's almost like I never really had a choice, because my dad, that's sort of the world in which he operated.
Right.
And although when I was really young, I had no inkling of that whatsoever, because he would just disappear and get into his world, immerse himself in his world. And then when he'd come home, he was just dad. He was just this regular, very gentle, nice, sweet guy. And then in your middle teens, his sons all then went out and saw the other dad.
Oh, right.
You go to the fights and you just see this totally different person.
Did you have a local theater, a local movie theater that you went to, or did you have to track down films on a TV channel?
Both of those. I mean, it's funny you ask that question, Jim, because that's a sad state of affairs now. I think all of the movie theaters that I went to in my youth are now churches.
Really?
They're all Korean Presbyterian church or something. The El Rey Cinema, the Parkside Cinema, the Empire Cinema. Those were all within walking distance of my house, and then I'd get on the streetcar and go downtown, and the Market Street Cinema and the Strand. Oh my God, I saw so many movies there. That had become a rep house by that time. Because Market Street in San Francisco was just filled with first run movie theaters, and there's none now. And it's it's a sore spot. But
Oh, I bet. I
but
bet.
yeah, so yes, there were movie theaters in San Francisco in virtually every neighborhood, and there were a lot of repertory cinemas, which is where I really caught up on my cinema education. You know, the Castro Theater and the Surf Interplayers and the Richelieu and the Centos Theater and the York, and I'm barely scratching the surface here. Uh, the Times Theater in North Beach was amazing because that was a different like double bill every day of old classic movies, and it was like a buck. Not they had 99-cent matinees and things. And
Wow.
holy
Wow.
cow!
Wow.
Yeah, and then of course there was the search on television, which I just recently introduced Detour on TCM, and I said, this is a movie that you had to search for once upon a time. You had to buy TV Guide and like look through and it'd be like 3 o'clock in the morning, movies till dawn, Detour. And it's like, oh, I heard about this, and that was there were no good prints even then, so you
Did
had
did
to watch it on TV.
did you have in New York we had this thing called $1 Million Movie where they would play the same movie at, I think it was like 6 times during the course of the week.
Right.
And if you loved a movie, you could really just completely get lost in it. I mean, was there a TV channel that really was speaking to you by programming the kind of films you loved?
Well, it was certainly my version of it was Dialing for Dollars out here. That was our $1 million movie, but it was on in the daytime. So let's just say it cut into my education, shall we say. And but yeah, they would show a movie, unfortunately, with a lot of commercial interruptions, because that's the whole point of Dialing for Dollars, right? I mean,
Right, right.
um, and but that's where I saw a lot of the films, Thieves Highway and The Big Heat and Cry of the City and stuff like that. Were all initially in the Dialing for Dollars afternoon shows. Then I would stay up late. Once I got my own TV in my room, my little portable TV, then I'd stay up all night watching movies, right?
Right. I was when I was a kid, somebody I mentioned The Big Sleep to a friend of mine. He must have been about 8 years old, and he said to me, "You know, that was a book." And I said, "What?" He said, "Oh yeah, they're all books." And so I was already an avid reader of kids stuff, but then I became an avid reader of crime fiction. Were you an avid reader as a kid?
I was a comic book kid, to be honest with you. I mean, I didn't start reading books until my early teens, but I was a comic book kid, and I actually was a pretty good illustrator for a little kid. And at one point, I thought that's what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to be a comic book writer and artist, Or back then, it was so divided. There weren't really guys who were writers and artists. It was like you were one or the other. So I was like going to be a comic book artist. And then my story about getting into crime fiction was Chinatown, because I saw Chinatown the day that opened in 1974, and that just turned my head completely around. And then when I noticed all the reviews saying, it's in the tradition of Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon and Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, then I went and found those books. And at that point, Ballantine had reissued a bunch of Chandler's books. You might remember, with those fabulous
Sure, great covers.
the cover art by a guy named Tom Adams, and that whole thing so appealed to me. Those book covers were a huge reason I just immersed myself. One summer, I read like every Chandler thing I could get my hands on, and Hammett as well. And then that, of course, leads into James M. Cain and Cornell Woolrich and Jim Thompson and all. The whole.
There it is.
You know it well. You know it
Yeah,
well, Jim.
no. Um, just going back to, I guess, to your dad, but also to your interest, was it inevitable that you'd become a newspaper man?
Um, I think it was inevitable that I would be a writer. That I think was inevitable, because my dad was an interesting inspiration to me, because I really don't know that he ever even graduated from high school.
Okay.
I remember he would just tell a story about how he was suspended from high school for when it was, they had to give an oral report. And my dad gave a very vivid oral report of sneaking into a fight club in San Francisco that was called the Bucket of Blood at 16th and Cap Streets. And my dad just basically gave his first report of boxing matches in high school and was suspended for it. And of course, that became his livelihood. And so this guy that I knew, who I lived in the house with, was like, well, if this guy can make a living putting words together, I guess I can do that too. And it was also very intriguing to me because what my dad wrote was different than who he was. And so I was immediately intrigued by that. Like, wow, when you sit down and write, you can actually become a different person, and I, as you can probably tell, Jim, I feel a real closeness to my dad just because we're basically the same person,
Yes, yes.
and and things have just turned out that way, and I see myself in him, or him and me all the time. Uh, I It's really funny because I cannot tell you when I was a kid how many times the phone would ring at like 1 o'clock in the morning in our house, and my dad would answer it all the time. Right? There was no mute on those phones, right? So my dad would answer the phone, and he'd go, "Yeah, right, yeah, Freddie Steele, 6th round, Seattle." And then he'd hang up the phone, and he was settling bets for guys at closing time in bars,
That's
who were
funny.
saying, "Well, I whatever." And now this is me, only it's all email, and it's people saying, "Can you tell me this movie that I saw when I was 8 years old, and this happened and that happened?" And it's just like, wow, I'm just doing my dad's, reliving my dad's life, only with movies instead of boxing.
But I didn't realize, Eddie, that you spent 16 years at a newspaper or at newspapers.
Yeah,
Well,
newspapers and magazines. Yeah.
what was your beat? I mean,
Oh, I weirdly, I wrote for a magazine for a while called Sports Travel. It was a short-lived magazine that was for traveling secretaries of sports teams, right? So my favorite story that I ever wrote was what to do when one of your players gets arrested in a road game. Like, how do you cope with that, right? And I wrote a lot of business stuff. I Jim, I could tell you how the rail business, the trucking business, the ocean shipping business, the air freight business. I could tell you the intricacies of these businesses, but you would be bored.
that's great. So at some point though, so now your worlds collide. You're writing, and now you start writing about film, and you write these delicious books about dames and film noir. But how did you and America Cinematique come together?
That was because I had written the book Dark City: The Lost World of Film Noir.
Great book, Eddie.
Thank you. I'm going to give a big plug to myself on this one. I was so thrilled that the Hollywood Reporter recently did this special event in conjunction with the American Film Institute, where they decided to pick the 100 greatest film books ever written. And I was one of the people that they sent a ballot to. I can't remember how many people in the industry were, solicited for their input on this, but Dark City was chosen as one of the 100 greatest film books, and I laugh because I didn't vote for it. And when I saw the final standings, I said, "Damn! If I had voted for myself, I probably could have jumped up about 10 or 12 places on this list."
That is funny. So, yeah, American Cinematique.
Yeah, they found the book, and Dennis Bartok and Gwen DeGlees, who were co-programmers uh, at the time. This was, I'm going to say, 1999, I think it was. And Dennis had bought multiple copies of the book as Christmas presents for a lot of the directors that I talked about who were still alive, like Andre Detolf and Bud Bedecker and a few other people. And and then I did a book signing in LA, and Gwen came, and that's I met her, and she said, "How would you like to program a festival?" And literally, Jim, that is how my life changed
Wow.
so dramatically, because we did the first festival, and I programmed it like this is the last time I'm ever going to do this, right? So I mean,
Mhm.
every night was triple bills, and we were trying to dig out the most obscure movies that people hadn't seen in literally in decades, and it really opened up a whole fascinating new world to me. And here's what was interesting about that is I went from having a life that honestly had was very solitary, the writer's life, right,
Right.
um, to one that was very public. And not only that, but that the work I was dedicating myself to was no longer, um, for lack of a better term, self-centered, right? I mean, there's a certain self-centeredness about writers that they must possess to feel like what I have to say is worth it. I'm just going to sit here alone and do this, even though the world isn't asking for it. I'm going to produce this work that I think has value. And you go from that to, well, my job now is to rescue somebody else's work. Right.
Right.
And now I'm kind of dedicated to, you know, finding the obscure work by some director who's long forgotten, or in some cases, like resurrecting a whole. I don't take sole credit for this, but like all the Argentine films that my foundation has rescued is really like putting Argentine cinema back on the map. I mean,
Right.
without that work, people just wouldn't know. There's no way they would ever have seen this stuff. So it really changed my life.
Right. But at this time, also, you were working on the Billy Nichols novels, right?
Absolutely. Well, that novel was like 10 or from the moment my dad died, which was I think in 1982, I believe. I think from that moment on, I was kind of working on that book, right? And
Right.
it didn't come out, of course, until 2000 and something. So it was a long time in the making. And I mean, I went through a huge. I always knew that I wanted to write a novel, right? And I
Right.
didn't want to be one of those people who said, you know, oh, when I write my novel, oh, wait till I write my novel. You know, it's like, no, I'm going to actually do this. And it took a long time. And what's very interesting, and I'd love to hear your take on this, because you know, you're a man of many and varied interests, but it's odd that I found the voice and the way to get this work published because of crime fiction.
Right.
Because it was not the book I was writing when I started was not a work of crime fiction. It was just a general, like a literary attempt to describe my dad's world. I mean, I was much more inspired by a book like Leonard Gardner's Fat City than I was, you know, the setup, or that's not a good example, but you
No,
know,
no, I get you.
where
Yeah,
there's no
sure.
crime at the center of it. The crime is basically the whole idea that people fight for a living, right? I mean, that's
Right.
the big hook there, right? Um, so anyway, that was intriguing to me, and so everything kind of dovetailed when I realized a writer I really respect named Bill Barrich read the first draft of my book when it was not a crime story, and he basically just said, I'm not feeling a reason to turn the pages." And you know, that was like the hardest thing a writer can hear, but it was like so right on. And Bill also gave me the best advice as a writer I've ever received, which is don't be afraid to be obvious. And it was
Yeah.
like, you know, a lot of writers, it's like, well, I don't want them to see me getting to the point. But of course,
Right. Right.
when you're a journalist, you learn like get to the freaking point, you know.
Right. Right.
So yes, all those things kind of combined to finally produce that book.
I'm having a thought here. Your books were set in the late 1940s, right? That's at least a decade before you were born.
Hmm.
I've noticed, there are many of us who have a sentimental attachment to a time period we never experienced. It's almost like there's such a thing as genetic memory or something like that. I wonder what explains that.
Well, it's interesting you say that because the film there's a film corollary there in that a lot of the movies that I love are from that period, and I'm fascinated by the passage of time. And like when I watch a movie like Thieves Highway, it's San Francisco in a period before I existed, and it's like, wow, that's what was there before. And then you see the after picture, and it's like, my life is like this. All of our lives are like this. There was
Right,
this,
right,
and there's no question that my immersion in that era was an attempt to kind of discover who my father was. Right.
right.
I mean, I would never in a million years would I advertise this book as like a son searches for the soul of his father. I mean, that's not the book that I wanted to write, but that was certainly one of the motivations for doing it. And I also, part of me is like, having been a journalist, and I love to do the research. And so in doing the research, I realized I don't want to write a book that just is copying the movie version of this era and putting it on the page. I'm going back to the newspapers, I'm going back to the magazines, I'm doing personal interviews with people. I want to recreate the period accurately, not just a movie person's version of it again.
Right,
So
right, right, right,
um and that was always fun. I mean, in the book, of course, since he's a newspaper man, I found it really interesting to like place the story, in historically accurate chronology. And then I'd go to those days and look at the old newspapers and see what was happening in the news, and then in the little marginalia, like weird deaths or accidents that happen.
right,
I
right,
found that being able to put that stuff in, like somebody's going to have a conversation about this, right? Because this weird thing happened in the newspaper that day, and
right.
and I find that just gives a level of authenticity to the whole thing that it is valuable, very valuable.
But it's also it's transportive also in a sense. I think the reader or the viewer can sense when the writer is being sincere and accurate in portraying events.
I totally agree. Uh, but by the same token, another great bit of advice I once got was, never let your research show.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
I mean, you can't. You have to learn it all so you can throw it away.
Right,
or
right,
or not throw it away, toss it off. You just
right.
toss it off like an aside. Like when you learn something about a certain street, you can incorporate it in there, but I find it's better as just like a passing glance
Yeah,
than a paragraph of description or something,
yeah,
like
yeah.
that the building was still standing there, the same blah 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 that it's been for 20 years. Instead of giving the history of the building, you just kind of toss it off like I've been down the street a million times before.
Right, right. When we first met, it was 2002. I had no idea about your interest in film. I knew that you were working on something with Tab Hunter, but my introduction to you was those two novels. And I, I have to say, Eddie, I really wish you would write another one.
Well, so do I. And so the good news is I'm halfway through another one.
Oh, fantastic.
The bad news is I've been halfway through it for 10 years.
That is
uh,
great.
but it will definitely get done. There's no question about that.
Great.
The thing is, Jim, it's so interesting is, I'm a writer. And that's how I identified myself. When I fill out my taxes, it doesn't say television personality. It doesn't
Right,
say, it says writer,
right,
self-employed writer. That is what I am.
right.
And it's been a really interesting trip for me, um, discovering all the different ways that ability can be applied, right? Because writing a novel is a totally different thing than writing for television or radio or I've designed museums where you have to write captions for the stuff in museums, and there's a whole different discipline and approach that's required there. Writing nonfiction is very, very different from writing fiction, just in the way that you approach it, like how you structure your time. One of the problems I'm having finishing that novel is because to write a novel, I just need time. Not because it's so hard, but because it's an immersive thing.
Yes.
It is a bit of time traveling. Like unless I feel like I'm really in that era, I don't feel the writing is coming off as genuine and particularly authentic. So it takes a lot of time as opposed
Right.
to the facility that you learn being a reporter and a journalist, whatever, is to write on deadline and to just get it done.
Right.
You know,
Do you, do, do you write the intros and outros for your presentations on Noir Alley?
oh yes,
And
oh
so that I think, Eddie, reveals your journalism background because they convey a lot of information in a few minutes. They are highly entertaining, but they are always to the point. And what I found recently is that this big collection on YouTube of your intros and outros.
yes.
And
Yes, somebody does that. I don't have any idea who that is.
and I have to
It's all
confess, Eddie, that if you are presenting a film that I've seen recently, I record it anyway, so I can just listen to what you have to say about it.
thank you.
I mean, it goes beyond your knowledge. It goes to your ability to present it.
Um, thank you for that. And yeah, I will say that my if I have an ability, as far as it goes with being a film expert, there are many people in the world that know way more than I do. But the thing I am particularly good at, I think, is conveying it. It's important to tell a story. And so, yes, I write all my own intros and outros because I believe each one is a story.
Right.
And like I have, I my credo is sort of barroom, not classroom. And so it's perfect that I now actually record my intros and outros in a bar, in an
Right.
actual bar in Oakland, California, because that's the vibe that I'm after. You do not want me standing in front of an amphitheater with a blackboard behind me or something like that. That's not my style. I want to be in the bar room telling you a story, and that's I'm glad that it comes through.
Oh, it definitely does. Eddie, I mentioned to you recently that I hadn't given enough consideration to the screenwriters of film noir. I guess I always considered it to be a director's genre or cinematographers, and I realize now that that was a big mistake on my behalf. I mean, what makes a great film noir screenplay to your mind?
The ones that are really noir to me, and we can have this conversation, Jim. I'm sure you've had this conversation with a lot of your guests on this show who write crime fiction. It's not really, it's not noir the if the villain isn't the protagonist of the story, or that the protagonist is compromised in some way and going over to the dark side. To me, that's kind of what the whole concept and ethos of noir implies. It's like you're taking a normal person who's fallen over or willfully rushing over to the dark side, right? That's the James M. Cain stories, right? That's the David Goodis stories. That as opposed to hard-boiled detective fiction, which is the protagonist's job is to sort things out and set them right. That's not what goes on in film noir. So to me, the best noir writers and screenwriters in Hollywood were the people who knew how to tell those stories within the constraints of the production code, which was constraining them terribly, and in terms of what they could show and the kind of behavior that could be depicted. Um, which is why I love those movies and why I love talking to kids about, there was a time when there was a production code that dictated what you could and couldn't show on screen, which blows kids' minds because, they're watching the grossest stuff on earth on the internet every day now.
Right, 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 right,
So the idea that there was some control exerted over this astounds them,
right.
and me too.
Do you have a favorite noir screenplay?
Um, Yeah, I guess. I mean, I have several. And what's interesting, Jim, is they would probably be identical to the films that I would say are the best.
Ah,
Because
uh-huh.
because I don't think that you can actually make a great film without a great screenplay. You can make a terrific, Orson Welles made a lot of really fabulous movies, but I hesitate to say they're great, except the obvious one, of course,
Right, right.
Citizen Kane. But because the screenplays just kind of ramble around. The lady from Shanghai is like, "What the hell's going on?" I mean, but it's fantastic. It's a great cinematic experience. But I would never put that in like the top 10 noir films ever made. Whereas The Asphalt Jungle or In a Lonely Place or The Maltese Falcon or Sunset Boulevard, these are genius screenplays, right? I think, and Double Indemnity. See, Billy Wilder gets in there twice because he was such a great screenwriter,
Right.
fantastic director, but an incredible screenwriter.
Wow.
And
Listen,
there's a writer who doesn't get a lot of credit, who I really really enjoy, who wrote crime fiction, named Jonathan Latimer, and he had this boozed up alcoholic PI named Bill Crane, and um, when Latimer got to Hollywood, he was kind of a disciple of Hammett and Chandler, but he was just an incredibly adept screenwriter. He wrote the screenplay for The Big Clock and Night Has a Thousand Eyes and Alias Nick Beale and a bunch of other things. And he was just really, really good. So he's somebody that I always go out of my way to point out
yeah.
that overlooked.
So listen, I understand that a new edition of Dark City Dames is coming.
Correct, coming out in April, and I'm very enthused about the whole thing because Running Press, who is the publisher now for all of my film related stuff, just did a spectacular job designing this book, and uh, it's a book I'm actually really proud of. In some ways, I mean, The Distance, the novel we've been talking about, The Distance, I feel is sort of the book that I was born to write. It's like,
Yeah.
I and I'm glad I ticked that off my list. But of the books that are just completely generated out of thin air,
Right.
Dark City Dames is my favorite, I think, just because I learned so much in the process of writing the book, and I was very pleased with the balance between using the skills that I developed as a journalist, interviewing people and really getting to intimate information, and writing it with a certain kind of style and flair that was not common in these types of books. I think it came together quite well, and I'm very happy to see it back in circulation.
I bet so many memories flooded back to you when you
Oh,
were going over the manuscript.
unbelievable. And it is interesting. Well, I'll tell you right off the bat, one of the most interesting things is the only change they really wanted to make to the book was in the title. And I thought, I wonder if they're going to allow me to call it Dark City Dames. Like, is somehow Dames like not acceptable anymore? And that's what I was worried about. But in fact, the issue was with the wicked women of film noir. And the book is now called The Women Who Defined Film Noir. Dark City Dames, The Women Who Defined Film Noir. So I thought that was, and it's not a battle that I felt it necessary to
Right.
fight over the title, because the content of the book is exactly what I intended it to be. Nothing was changed. And
Right.
so I'm very happy about that. But it is funny because I think it speaks to a state of publishing right now where I think publishers are sometimes afraid that people will have a bad reaction to something without even reading it.
Right.
Just like the title is enough. We're gonna object to this.
Right.
And
Eddie, speaking of Wicked, would you mind repeating the Anne Savage anecdote you told this weekend?
well,
I,
it's also in the book. Yeah. So, yeah, this was very early on in my relationship with Anne. We had met a couple of times, and just getting to know her really inspired me to want to do this as a book project, right? It began as a magazine article. And then I said, Anne is too deep. There's too much stuff going on here. This is going to take a book or something. And so we talked, and then she invited me back to her apartment, and she was very, very engaging. And then as I was going to leave, she said, Eddie, wait a moment. And she takes me by the arm and leads me into her bedroom. And I'm like, oh, okay. I thought she was going to show me pictures on her vanity or something. And she
Right.
says, go over there and kneel down by the bed. And I was, my heart skipped a couple of beats, and I'm like, what is going on? And she said, now look underneath the bed. And there, of course, on the floor on a towel, all laid out, and it was majestic. Oiled and clean was her arsenal of like a shotgun, a hunting rifle, a couple of handguns. And I look up at her and she says, now you know not to cross me. It's like, holy cow.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so
Just the
she agreed to
best.
do the book, and we became very, very close. In fact, I was the co-executor of her estate after she had died, and she was really something.
Right. Eddie, I could listen to your stories all day and night, and I bet our listeners could too. Once again, I want to advise them to make sure to check out noircity.com, Noir City Magazine, for additional doses of noir history. And of course, don't miss Noir Alley on TCM. Eddie Muller, thanks so much for joining us at Writers at
Oh,
Work.
Jim, this was such a pleasure. It went by so fast. I'm like, are we just warming up now? And it's like, oh no, we're done. We're done. Well,
Eddie,
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a slightly different facet of my life. So thanks.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.